Excuse me. We can conclude from thousands of studies in this area that ADHD arises from multiple sources, not just one. So there's not going to be a single gene for ADHD, nor is ADHD necessarily always caused by genetic factors. There are multiple things that interact to lead to ADHD developing. But we know that all of the recognized causes to date are in the realm of biology, medicine, specifically neurology and genetics. We have no evidence now that ADHD can arise purely from social factors such as diet, parenting, poor education, and so on. So that social factors, conditions in society, are not going to cause ADHD unless they also increase the risk for a biological factor. So, for instance, poverty doesn't cause ADHD, but because being in poverty can lead to malnutrition, increased drug abuse such as alcohol and tobacco use. It can lead to increased pregnancy complications and even premature delivery of the child. So all of those biological risks may occur in impoverished groups more than others. And those are the factors that are influencing brain development, and through those adverse influences contribute to risk for ADHD as well. So even where it might look like a social factor, like economic status, is related to ADHD, it's because that factor is related to other biological risks that pose harm to the development of the nervous system. So ADHD arises largely from genetic and other neurological factors. We will find that there are people with ADHD that is familial, inherited, and genetic. We will also find some people with ADHD where their ADHD arises because of major genetic disorders like chromosome problems and breakages. But then there's going to be another group of ADHD that didn't inherit their disorder or have a genetic problem, but because they were exposed to biological hazards, are going to have problems with the development of their brain, and especially of the brain's executive networks. And that is going to give rise to an acquired version of ADHD. Now, we also know that there are multiple genes that cause ADHD, and these genes might interact with some things in the environment to further increase risk. For example, we know that if a child inherits several of the ADHD risk genes, they may be 3 to 4 times more likely to have ADHD. But if their parents drank alcohol, especially the mother, during her pregnancy with this child, it magnifies the risk to 8 times the risk of having ADHD in that child. So certain genes for ADHD may interact with certain toxins or diseases in the environment to further increase the risk for the disorder. And we're beginning to see evidence of that as well. We also might see that the genetics of ADHD leads you to engage in certain risk-taking behaviors that are going to come back and cause brain injury. So for instance, someone with ADHD takes more risks, becomes more impulsive, has more accidental injuries, including traumatic brain injury, or TBI, as I say on this slide. And we know that traumatic brain injuries can cause ADHD even in someone who didn't have it before, and can worsen ADHD in someone who already has it. So there, the genes for the disorder create a behavior pattern that causes a risk for injury, and the injury feeds back to increase further the risk for and severity of their ADHD. Despite all of this complexity, all of these multiple causes, ADHD arises from a single common pathway. Whatever it is we're looking at as a cause, has been shown to have some effect on the development of the front part of the brain and the brain's executive network, often called the frontostriatal cerebellar network. But that's no matter. The words here, the terms, aren't important. What is important is that there's a network in the brain that is responsible for self-control, for executive functioning, and ADHD adversely affects that network, and that leads to the symptoms of the disorder. As I've said, there's simply no evidence that purely social factors like parenting or like playing video games or too much screen time on your smart technology causes ADHD. We have no evidence supporting that. So to summarize what I've said in the last slide in a picture, this is from a book by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Joel Nigg at the University of Oregon Health Sciences Center, and it shows in a very simplified form all of the causes of ADHD and what percentage or proportion of ADHD cases is it likely to cause. As you can see here, genetics, inheritance accounts for about 2/3 of all cases of ADHD in the population. The disorder runs in families. The child has inherited the genes for the disorder from one or both parents and other relatives, and that increases the likelihood they're going to have the same disorder that the relatives had. I do want to point out, however, that about 10% of ADHD, of the cases put in the genetic category, arise from a new discovery that was shown in the past few years, and that is that new mutations can occur in the genes that the child inherits that the parents don't have. These new mutations, often called de novo mutations, can happen in the sperm and the egg of the parent. So that when we do a blood test of the parent and we look at their DNA, we don't see any of these risk genes. And yet, when we look at the child's DNA, they're there. How did they get there in that child? Because at some point during the process of creating the genes in the egg and sperm that go to the child, a mutation took place, and it converted a typical gene into an ADHD risk gene. And now that increases the odds the child will have the disorder, even though those genes and the disorder do not occur in that family before then. About 10% of ADHD cases arise from such new mutations. The other third of ADHD cases, as you see here, come from the other factors that I've already mentioned, such as being born prematurely or having a very low birth weight, such that you have to go into a neonatal intensive care unit for a while before you're allowed to be released to your family. It can come from being exposed to toxins like fetal alcohol exposure, other toxic ingredients, or even consuming lead in early childhood. Smoking was thought to contribute to ADHD, but we can now put a question mark next to that because it turns out that it may not be the smoking, that smoking is a marker that the parent has ADHD, and that's why they're smoking during the child's pregnancy. So it's not the smoking, it's the fact that adults with ADHD are more likely to smoke. And it's the genetic relationship between the parent and the child that's the cause here. The smoking is just a signal, an indicator that the adult, one of the parents, has ADHD. Pregnancy complications, infections, birth complications such as respiratory distress syndrome and others can also contribute to injury to the brain, particularly to the front part of the brain. And that could cause risk for ADHD as well. And then there are many other very small factors here, possibly pesticides, vitamin deficiencies, infections with other viruses or bacteria. Perhaps, for instance, the streptococcal bacteria might also increase risk for ADHD. So these other factors are also biological factors. But all of this is to say There is no social factor on this diagram that by itself causes ADHD. And it is for that reason that ADHD has now been classified in our diagnostic manual as a neurodevelopmental disorder. Another reason for classifying it are the neuroimaging findings that we see in hundreds of studies of brain size, connectivity, and functioning. Excuse me. These studies can be summarized very simply, and I'm oversimplifying what are very complex research findings, that there are certain parts of the brain that are smaller, less active, less mature in people with ADHD than in typical people of the same age, based on various neuroimaging measures, such as MRI or fMRI or PET scans and so on. That doesn't concern us here. What concerns us is that there's a very consistent pattern across many of these studies showing that the frontal lobe, particularly the orbital frontal area here, and also the right side of the brain more than the left frontal lobe, that are smaller, less active, and less mature than they should be. The midline at the frontal lobe between the two hemispheres, known as the anterior cingulate cortex, is also smaller and less functional. These areas of the brain project nerve cells, networks, back into the central part of the brain. And one of those central areas is the basal ganglia. And we have found that this area of the brain is also smaller, less active, and delayed in its development. A fourth area is at the back of the brain, the ancient, older brain called the cerebellum. Often it's thought that this is involved in motor coordination, in the timing of our actions and their smoothness, their gracefulness, if you will. But we know that the cerebellum is critical to higher mental activities like thinking, planning, and self-regulation. So it's not surprising to find that parts of the cerebellum are less active, smaller, and delayed in development more than in typical people. There's some evidence that the bundle of fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, known as the corpus callosum, that the front part of that bundle of nerves, the splenium, is also smaller. But that would make sense. If the frontal lobes are smaller, then no surprise that the fibers of nerves that connect them would be smaller too. A little bit of evidence that a structure deep in the brain near the basal ganglia called the thalamus might also be smaller, but that's less certain. We do know that the size of these brain areas and the degree of activity in them is directly correlated with how severe your ADHD is going to be. So we have connected the dots, so to speak, in the diagram. The neuroimaging findings are related to the behavioral symptoms of the disorder. And while there's a few small gender differences between boys and girls or between men and women, they're not worth mentioning here because they're not important to our understanding of ADHD, despite the fact there might be a few differences. Critics of ADHD, particularly social critics who are against giving medication to ADHD, such as the Church of Scientology here in the United States. Members of that church have criticized these findings by saying that these problems with brain development were the result of giving ADHD medications to these children, and that's what caused the injury. Well, of course, that's not true, and to prove it, all of these studies have since been repeated with children and adults who never took ADHD medications, and we find exactly the same results. So don't let anybody scare you into thinking that ADHD and the medications we use to treat it, that the medication causes the brain damage. It does not. This is just one of hundreds of studies that illustrates the degree of delay in ADHD. I showed it earlier on my second slide about the history of ADHD. And what you see here is that the darker the color, the greater the delay is in the maturation of this outside area, the gray matter, the cortex of the brain, and that it's mainly in the frontal lobes, which are here. If we look down on top of the brain, which is what the perspective is here, we can see that it's primarily the frontal lobes, here's the right and the left frontal lobe, that are delayed in their development. The frontal lobes are the executive brain. They allow for self-regulation. To some extent, you will notice the back part of the brain here is also delayed in maturation. Why is that? After all, these are the visual centers of the brain. Well, as I said, ADHD greatly interferes with working memory. And one type of working memory is visual imagery. The ability to reflect and recall images and thoughts about your past as you think about what you're going to do. We use visual imagery a lot for self-regulation, much like you use it in your GPS in your car. So we should not be surprised then to see that some of the centers of the brain related to working memory, particularly visual imagery, are just as delayed as the frontal executive networks are in the brain. These networks that I'm mentioning, the executive network, can be split into 4 different networks, and all of them, to one degree or another, are impaired, dysfunctional, or at least quite variable in their functioning in people with ADHD. Now, one of those is from the frontal lobe into this basal ganglia that you see here. That is the what network. What I think about, information I hold in working memory, reaches back to guide my behavior and what I'm going to do through the motor strip and into the basal ganglia, the what network, the working memory network. The second network is going to go from this part of the brain through that basal ganglia, and there's your cerebellum that I mentioned earlier. That network is the timing network of the brain. It's responsible for your sense of time, but more importantly, for the timing of your actions, using your sense of time to guide behavior, to sequence behavior, and to know when to execute a behavior. Because when we do something can be as critical to its success as what we propose to do. That's our timing circuit, and that's why ADHD has been referred to in my other lectures as time blindness. It interferes with the guidance of behavior by our sense of time and leads to massive problems in time management in people with ADHD. The third circuit of the brain is known as the hot circuit. Okay, this is the circuit that goes from the frontal lobes through the midline, you can't see it here, of the frontal lobe, and down to the amygdala. So you see, inhibition and emotion regulation, that is, what we think about, is going to reach down and control how we feel, the emotions we express. And it's going to allow us to have an executive control, a self-regulation control over the emotional brain, which starts with the amygdala and in general encompasses the limbic system around here. So that's the emotional brain, and that's the self-control of emotion. And you can see why ADHD individuals have such difficulty with emotional control. The fourth circuit of the brain goes from the frontal lobe, again to the midline that you can't see here, right? Back to the posterior part of the brain, on both sides, often known as the parietal lobe. If I back up, you can see it here on the left, or on the left side, and here on the right side. Okay? Notice that that's a little delayed too. All right? That circuit is self-awareness. Awareness of myself in space, which is what the posterior part of the brain is doing, and awareness of myself internally and emotionally. That's what the anterior cingulate and amygdala are doing. Put them together, and I'm aware of myself outside and inside. Self-awareness over time. And now you know why self-awareness is such a problem for people with ADHD. As I've said, the emotional brain is involved in ADHD. You see it here. I've already drawn it for you, but it's the frontal lobe that goes down through the midline and into the amygdala here. And this is the limbic system, the emotional brain. And that is impaired in ADHD as well. So ADHD, while we call it an attention disorder, is understood now to be a disorder of executive functioning and of all four networks of executive functioning, leading to problems with inhibition, working memory, self-restraint, emotion regulation, self-motivation, planning, and problem solving, along, of course, with self-awareness, if I didn't mention that already. So how can we fit this new executive theory of ADHD into the clinical description of ADHD? It's very easy. I'll do it quickly. Executive functioning is one thing, represented by the light blue box. Self-regulation over time to improve our future. We can split this idea or construct into two dimensions, two broad dimensions of behavior and mental functioning: inhibition and metacognition, the working memory functions. Now, it can also help if we take each of these major dimensions or mental abilities and carve them up into very specific minor abilities. It helps us to understand the disorder and executive functioning better. And I've already described all of these for you in this presentation earlier. There are many kinds of inhibition: motor, verbal, mental, emotional, motivational. And there are kinds of attention: nonverbal working memory, verbal working memory, remembering what you're doing, planning and problem solving, and then the ability to manage emotions once they're expressed. Now can you see how ADHD would fit in here? ADHD is comprised of two dimensions. There's the inhibition dimension, which we call hyperactive impulsive behavior, but is really a subset of that executive function dimension. And then there is the inattention symptoms, which are misnamed because they're just a subset of the problem with metacognition, executive attention, if you want to call it that, and all of its components. This is really what ADHD is all about. It's an executive function disorder.